I want you to picture a shelf, not a tackle shelf, a garden shelf. Bottom row, where the bags get dusty and nobody looks. There is a paper sack down there with a dark red powder inside it, and it costs about $2. You have walked past it 100 times. And here is the strange part, that powder does pull fish. Not every fish, but closer to every fish than you would ever guess, and I will give you the real number in about 90 seconds. It is not the number you have heard. And in at least 14 states, using it the way almost everybody uses it will get you a citation. Both of those things are true. I checked. I read the statutes myself, and I am going to read one of them to you word for word. But the story you have been told about why, the mad cow disease story, the tackle industry lobbying story, the forever chemicals story, that story is built on a federal law that says the exact opposite of what they claim it says. I pulled the regulation. The definition is one sentence long, and it lets blood meal walk right through. So somebody has been lying to you, and the frustrating part is, they did not need to. The truth here is stranger, and far more useful. I have spent a lot of years around managed water. Ponds people owned, ponds people ruined. I have carried bags exactly like this one down to the bank and put them in the water on purpose. And I have stood on that same bank a week later looking at dead fish turning over in the shallows because of what I did. That is not a story the tackle aisle is ever going to tell you. Let us start with the number. They told you 92% of the catfish in a tank, supposedly, in an Auburn University study. That study does not exist. I looked for it. No such paper, no such author, no such experiment. It is a number somebody typed because it sounded devastating. Here is the real number, and I think it is better. Channel catfish, blue cats, flatheads, bullheads, carp, buffalo, suckers, minnows, shiners, chubs. Every one of those fish belongs to one enormous biological group. Scientists call it the Ostereophysi. That group accounts for roughly 75% of all freshwater fish species in the world. 3 out of every 4 species swimming in fresh water share the same basic wiring. And part of that wiring is a chemical sense so far past ours that comparing the two is almost pointless. A channel catfish is not a fish with a nose. A channel catfish is a nose that swims. Its receptors run down the barbels, along the flanks, across the belly, out to the tail. When Dr. John Caprio at Louisiana State University mapped this out, what he described was an animal that tastes the water it is standing in. So when a title tells you a powder attracts every fish in the lake, that is not as ridiculous as it sounds. It is not every fish, but it is the majority shareholder. Hold on to that 75%. It comes back later in this video, and when it does, it is going to mean something very different, something you are not going to like. Now, the law. Because this is where the entire internet gets it wrong, and it is also where you can genuinely get in trouble. Let me read you something. This is from the state of Idaho's own fishing regulations. General rules. The section you were supposed to read before you bought your license. Idaho defines chumming as, and I am quoting the state here, the use of any substance not attached to a hook that is intended to attract fish. And then Idaho says, it is illegal to chum while fishing in Idaho. Go back over that definition. Any substance, not attached to a hook, intended to attract fish. That is not a rule about blood meal. Blood meal is not mentioned. The words never appear. Idaho did not ban a product. Idaho banned a behavior, and a scoop of red powder tossed off the bank walks straight into it. Utah goes further. Chumming prohibited on all waters, with 2 named exceptions, Lake Powell and Flaming Gorge. And Utah writes the definition even wider, depositing in the water any substance not attached to a hook, line, or trap which may attract fish. Nevada, prohibited, except Lake Mead. Colorado, Oregon, Hawaii, Kentucky, Maine, North Dakota, South Carolina, Vermont, Rhode Island in trout water. New Mexico allows it in a short list of named rivers and nowhere else. California permits it in a handful of specific freshwater districts. Minnesota does not even use the word. They get to the same place through a statute that makes it unlawful to deposit animal parts into public water. Count them up. You land right around 14, 15, depending on how you treat the partial states. So the number in the title is real. The ban is real. What is fake is the reason. Because now drive one state over, Kansas. The Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks answers this question in plain language on their own website. It is legal to bait, or chum, to attract fish. There are no state regulations about it. Same country, same fish, same powder. Cross one line on a map and you go from a citation to a shrug. That should tell you something. If this stuff were a biological weapon, a disease vector, an ecological grenade, Kansas would not be waving it through. Regulators are a lot of things. Casual about real hazards is not one of them. So what is the 14-state thing actually about? Litter, fair chase, feeding wildlife, water quality, the same instinct that stops you dumping a bag of dog food in a state park. It is not a conspiracy, and I am about to prove that using the exact law they cite at you. Every one of these videos points at the same document, and they say it with a very grave voice. The 1997 Food and Drug Administration Ruminant Feed Ban, Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 589.2000. Mad cow disease, prions. It sounds airtight. It is a real regulation. The citation is correct. So I pulled it up. Anybody can. It is free, public, and it takes 90 seconds. Apparently nobody bothered. The rule opens with definitions, and the very first one tells you what counts as prohibited protein. Listen for a single word. Protein derived from mammalian tissues means any protein-containing portion of mammalian animals, excluding blood and blood products. Blood and blood products. Blood meal is not banned by that regulation. Blood meal is written into the exemption. The Food and Drug Administration looked at dried blood, weighed the prion question, and specifically carved it out. And that regulation is not about fishing in the first place. It governs what you are allowed to feed to cattle. It is a livestock feed rule. It has about as much to do with your catfish rod as the building code has to do with your truck. So they handed you a section number, a year, an agency, and a disease, and every one of those details was accurate, and the conclusion was still backwards. That is the most effective kind of lie there is, the one wrapped in homework. That is the first thing they got backwards. Here is the second, and this one may actually be costing you fish. You will hear this claim in every one of these videos. The cheap bag is better. The garden center bag is batch-dried. And batch-dried supposedly means it releases slowly, in 2 beautiful layers, and beats the expensive stuff. That is not a small error. That is upside down. Blood meal is made by drying blood, and how you dry it decides everything. Spray drying is fast and relatively cool. Ring drying is hotter. Batch drying is the crudest method there is. Long exposure, high heat, hours in the dryer. And protein does not enjoy being cooked. Heat drives the Maillard reaction, the same browning chemistry that turns a steak dark on a hot skillet. In blood meal, that reaction locks the amino acids inside structures almost nothing can pry back open. Not a cow's gut, not a bacterium, and certainly not the water in your lake. Here are the actual published numbers out of Feed Science. These are not mine. Spray-dried blood meal, lysine availability above 90%. Ring-dried, somewhere around 84 to 89%. Batch-dried, 62 to 77%. And in one digestibility trial, a batch-dried meal came in at 48 to 49%, less than half. And there is a tell you can see with your own 2 eyes, standing right there in the aisle. Overcooked blood meal goes dark because the heat destroys the hemoglobin, and overcooked blood meal is measurably less palatable. Darker is not stronger. Darker is burnt. So that cheap sack somebody told you was the insider's secret. It is the bottom of the barrel. It is the batch that got left in the dryer too long. Does that make it useless? No. And what it is actually good for is going to surprise you, and I will get there. But the whole premise, that the $2 bag beats the expensive laboratory bottle, was invented by somebody who has never opened a feed science paper in their life. There is one more piece of chemistry they mangled, and it is the one that matters most on the bank. They told you that when blood meal hits the water, the hemoglobin breaks apart into free amino acids, just falls open, like a suitcase with a bad latch. It does not. A fish does not smell protein. A fish smells dissolved molecules, small, free, water-soluble things drifting individually through the water column. Intact protein is a folded, tangled, heavy thing. To turn it into free amino acids, you need hydrolysis, enzymes or acid, or time plus bacteria. Not lake water, not in 20 minutes. Which means a scoop of dry powder thrown off a dock does exactly one thing well. It sinks. It clouds up beautifully. It looks like something is happening. And then most of it settles into the mud as a fine red silt, while the signal you were counting on stays locked inside proteins that never opened. And one more detail nobody ever mentions. Blood meal is famously short on isoleucine and short on the sulfur amino acids, methionine and cysteine. It is not a master key ring that fits every lock on the wall. It is a key ring with 3 teeth missing. So the bag underdelivers on the one job everybody assumes it does perfectly. Annoying, but survivable. The next part is not. Quick thing before we go there, because what is coming is the part you will want on paper. I built the blueprint for this one. Every regulation I quoted, with the section number, so you can pull it and check me. The drying method table, the oxygen chart, the species list, and a laminate-it do and do not page for the boat. It is free, no email, nothing to buy. Link is in the description, and the code is on your screen for a few seconds if you would rather point your phone at it. All right? Oxygen. They invented an Auburn University study, and that is the part that actually bothers me. Because Auburn is not a random name somebody threw in a hat. Auburn is one of the great fisheries schools on this planet, and there is a real man there whose whole career has been about exactly what happens when you put a bag of protein into a body of water. Dr. Claude E. Boyd, Professor Emeritus, School of Fisheries, Aquaculture and Aquatic Sciences, Auburn University. He wrote the textbooks. When a state extension office tells a pond owner how to fertilize, they are quoting him, whether they know it or not. And what his work tells you is the exact opposite of what that video told you. When you put organic nitrogen into water, you are not releasing a signal, you are delivering a load. Bacteria find that protein. Bacteria eat that protein. And bacteria breathe while they do it. They pull oxygen out of the water, the same oxygen the fish is pulling across its gills. Now stack that against something the United States Geological Survey has published for decades. The warmer the water, the less oxygen it can physically hold. Around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, water holds near 11 milligrams of oxygen per liter. Push it to 86 degrees, and you are down around 7. The lake did not do anything wrong. That is just physics. So picture a July afternoon, a shallow back cove. No wind on it, no current through it, water past 80 degrees, oxygen already thin, and you walk down and dump a cup of high-nitrogen animal protein into it. You have just built a small bacterial engine in the one pocket of that lake that could least afford one. Oxygen sags, and a fish does not sit there and deliberate about oxygen. A fish leaves. You thought you rang the dinner bell. You may have cleared the room. I have watched anglers do this for years, and then blame the barometer, blame the moon, blame the front that came through Tuesday. It was not the moon. You suffocated your own spot. And the fix costs nothing, which is precisely why nobody will ever sell it to you. Put your scent where the water is moving. Current is oxygen, a creek arm with flow, a point with wind pushing into it, a channel edge, a bridge pinch, the tail race below a dam. Moving water can absorb an organic load and carry the signal downstream instead of letting it rot in place. Dead water cannot do either. That one sentence is worth more than every bottle on the Attractant wall. And it will never appear on a package, because there is nothing in it to sell. Now the part I have been holding back. Remember the 75%? The Ostariophysi, catfish, carp, minnows, suckers. That group did not just inherit an extraordinary sense of smell. It inherited something else. And in 1938, a scientist worked out what it was, and it is one of the strangest findings in the history of fish biology. Carl von Frisch. He would go on to win a Nobel Prize, Most people know him for decoding the honeybee dance. But before the bees, he was working with European minnows, and he saw something he could not explain. When one minnow in the tank was injured, skin torn, not killed, just torn, the whole shoal changed. They approached at first, and then they broke, panic, dashing, freezing, jamming themselves into the corners. Von Frisch worked out that the injured fish was releasing a chemical from its damaged skin, and the others were smelling it. He gave that chemical a name, and the name has stuck for almost 90 years. Schreckstoff, fright substance. And for 86 years, nobody could say what it actually was. Chemists went after it for generations. They all failed. Then, in 2024, a team led by Yoshihiro Yoshihara at the Riken Center for Brain Science published the answer in the journal Current Biology, and the answer explains why it took so long. It is not one chemical, it is two separate compounds carrying two separate pieces of information, and the fish only breaks into the panic response when it detects both at the same time. A biological password. Two keys, turned together. Now here is why I am telling you this on a fishing channel. Schreckstoff lives in the Ostariophysi, that same group, catfish, carp, minnows, your fish. So think about what a lot of anglers do on an ordinary Saturday. They catch a bullhead or a small carp, or they net a bucket of shiners. They chop them up, and they put that in the water, as chum, as a scent trail, hoping to call in catfish and carp. There is a real possibility that what they are broadcasting is not a dinner invitation. It is an alarm. It is the chemical sentence, something with teeth just tore one of us open. Right here, a minute ago. Now let me be straight with you, because that is the deal on this channel. The literature says this response is strongest and best documented within a species. Cross-species alarm effects are reported, and they show up between related fish, but the picture is messier, and the strength depends on how close the relationship is. Nobody has run the clean experiment on a Tennessee River flathead. I am not going to tell you this is settled science, because it is not. But you know what carries none of that risk? Cut bait from outside the club. Shad, gizzard shad, herring, sunfish and bluegill, where your state allows them as bait. Not one of those is an Ostariophysian. Not one of them carries that alarm chemistry. Same effort. Same cost, zero chance of screaming at the fish you are trying to invite. And I would very much like to hear from the catfish guys on this one. I know somebody out there is already typing. All right, enough theory. What do you actually do this weekend? 4 moves, all cheap, all legal in most places, and everyone exists because of something we just went through. Before any of it, check your state and local regulations. I am not your conservation officer. The rules change, and they change by lake, not just by state. Move 1. Learn the word attached. That is the hinge the entire law swings on. Idaho. Any substance not attached to a hook. Utah. Not attached to a hook, line, or trap. Colorado carves out fishing with baited hooks explicitly. Over and over, the statutes draw the same line between what is on your rig and what is loose in the water. So if you want scent working for you in a chumming restricted state, the scent belongs on the bait or on the rig, and it stays there. A paste worked around your bait, a sponge on the hook shank, a scent-holding bait that came out of the bag that way. What you do not do is deposit a loose pile. That is not me teaching you a clever loophole. That is the actual line the legislature drew, and it is the line the officer is going to look at. And in a chumming legal state, it is still litter if you overdo it. Pennsylvania says so out loud in their own regulations. Do not coat a river. Move 2. Stop feeding dead water. This is the oxygen lesson turned into a decision. If the water is over 80 degrees, and there is no wind on it, and no current in it, and it is shallow, that spot cannot metabolize a scent load. It will go sour before it goes to work. Move to flow. A creek mouth, a wind-blown bank, a channel swing, anywhere the water is going somewhere. Scent is not a broadcast. Scent is a thread, and it needs a hand to pull it. Move 3. Pick your cut bait from outside the club. Chasing catfish or carp, Use shad, herring, or sunfish where legal. Leave the carp, the bullheads, the shiners, and the minnows out of your chum. Best case, it makes no difference at all. Worst case, you have been telling your target species that a predator just worked their neighborhood. There is no version of that trade where you come out behind. Move 4. If you are going to use protein, break it first. Dry powder is not a signal. Soluble hydrolyzed material is a signal. So do not sprinkle. Soak. Wet the material, give it time, let it start coming apart, and use the liquid. A small amount of broken down soluble protein in a paste on your hook will out-signal a whole cup of dry powder thrown into the lake, and it will do it without tripping a single line of the Chumming statute. Notice what all 4 of those have in common. Not one of them requires you to buy anything. That is the entire reason nobody tells you. There is no patent on the word attached. There is no product number for dissolved oxygen. Nobody has ever printed "Consider the taxonomic superorder of your cut bait" on a package, because the day you understand it, you stop needing the aisle. One last thing, and this is the one that made me want to make this video in the first place. I told you the $2 bag is not useless. Here is what it is actually for. Go back to Dr. Boyd at Auburn. His life's work is not about hijacking a fish's brain for an afternoon. It is about something slower and vastly more powerful. Pond fertilization. Put nitrogen and phosphorus into a pond in the right amount, and you feed the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton feed the zooplankton. The zooplankton feed the fry and the minnows. The minnows feed the bluegill. The bluegill feed the bass. You are not calling fish. You are building them. Extension services across the South have taught this for half a century, and the fish come out measurably bigger and measurably more numerous. That bag of blood meal is a legitimate, powerful tool. On water you own, at the right dose, over weeks. And the same man will tell you exactly how it goes wrong. Overload a pond with organic matter. The bacterial oxygen demand outruns the supply. The bloom crashes, and you walk down one morning to a shoreline of turned-over fish. That is not a hypothetical. That happens every summer, to somebody. So the real story of this powder is not that it is a forbidden lure. The real story is that it is a fertilizer. It was always a fertilizer. And the industry never buried it because there was nothing to bury. Nobody can sell you a product whose instructions read, own a pond, wait 6 weeks, buy nothing else. That is what economic invisibility actually looks like. Not a conspiracy, just a true thing with no shelf to sit on. Before I let you go, let me be clear about what I did not verify, because that is the deal here. I did not find a peer-reviewed study testing garden center blood meal on wild catfish. If one exists, I could not locate it, and neither could anybody quoting a 92% number. The amino acid chemoreception is well established. The drying data comes from livestock nutrition research, not from a lake. The Schreckstoff work is solid, and the 2024 Riken paper is real. But the cross-species question is genuinely open, and I told you that when I got there instead of burying it. The regulations I quoted were accurate when I pulled them. They change. Yours may already have. Check your state and local regulations every single time, and do not use a stranger on the internet as your legal defense. And do not use this stuff in a way that hurts the water. Do not dump protein into a lake you love. Do not move bait or live fish between water bodies. Do not leave an open sack of dried blood sitting in camp. There are animals besides fish that find it very interesting. So, here is where I take my hits. I think most chumming on public water makes your spot worse, not better. I think you are feeding fish that were already going to eat your bait, and I think you are patiently teaching them that free food does not have a hook in it. I have watched heavily chummed banks get harder over a season, not easier. Tell me I am wrong. Tell me about the hole you have chummed for 20 years that still gives fish up. I want the counterexample. I want the water, and I want the season, and I want to know what you put in it. The $2 bag on the bottom shelf is real. The fish response is real. The 14 states are real. Everything they told you about why, that part was for sale. Take care of the water. I will see you out there.